You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. From Toronto, Ontario, this is Samia Sayed. Welcome back to the show. Coming up is an interview on bringing a Muslim's perspective to Remembrance Day. But first, let's take a look at some headlines. Canada commemorates Remembrance Day. UN Security Council ineffective, says Bob Rae. Councillors past racism worries Pickering locals. Jailed British Egypt hunger striker refuses water. And now the details. Canada today marks Remembrance Day with events across the country to acknowledge veterans and soldiers lost since World War I. Originally known as Armistice Day, November 11th marks the agreement that ended World War I in 1918 on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The name was changed to Remembrance Day in 1931. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau missed the Remembrance Day ceremony in Ottawa because he is attending a summit in Cambodia. Salma Zahid, MP for Scarborough Centre, tweeted that we remember the valor and bravery of thousands of Canadians who gave their lives so we can enjoy freedom today. Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the UN, says that after 77 years, the UN Security Council is no longer working. Rae told a media source that the council is deeply divided. He says the council struggles acting on the most pressing international crises, failing most of the time. Rae blames the lack of effectiveness on the veto power. The veto power has long been a bone of contention between the UN body and the 5 permanent Security Council members, which include the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. Rae says that when members have veto powers, they block effective solutions to international issues. Lisa Robinson, recently elected Pickering City Councillor, begins her term amidst controversy over past alleged racist tweets. Robinson, when running for office in September last year, was told to step down by the Conservative Party of Canada after alleged racist tweets resurfaced. Robinson's opponent had posted screenshots of her tweets from 2017 where she says, quote, "Muslims, go home if our Canadian heritage offends you so much." Robinson's successful campaign for Pickering Ward 1 has met with criticism on social media. She says she has changed since then and promises to be a strong voice for diverse communities. Jailed British Egyptian activist Ala Abdel Fattah, who is on a hunger strike and began refusing water to coincide with the COP27 climate summit, is in good health, Egypt's prosecutor contended Thursday. According to a media source, Fattah's family says jail authorities told them that Fattah is under medical intervention, possibly meaning he has been force-fed. Fattah has been locked in an Egyptian jail for most of the last decade for sharing, quote, false news about the death of a political prisoner in 2019. Human rights activists have gathered in support of prisoners of conscience during COP27 climate conference in Egypt. That's it for the news. People across Canada are marking National Remembrance Day, whether this was by attending a ceremony, visiting a memorial, or standing for a moment of silence. But where do Muslims fit into this war? They were certainly in Canada by then, but how were they involved in the Canadian effort? Joining us now from British Columbia to tell us more is Brother Bassam Abunadi, the director of Reclaim. Welcome, Brother Bassam, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Brother Bassam, this is quite a large topic to unpack in just a short interview, but tell me, how were Muslims involved in World War I?
All right, so typically in the Canadian national consciousness, we imagine the First World War as, despite its name, as a primarily European war. So we imagine British and French boys facing off against German and Austro-Hungarian boys. Within the theater of this war, we imagine the Ottoman front as the sideshow. In fact, it was often referred to as such. And this is where a lot of my work focuses on. It's reframing the First World War as a truly global war. I think that's where I'd like to start.
Mhm. And how do you reframe it to involve Muslims into that narrative when you share this stories or these accounts to Canadians?
Uh, when I think back to my high school experience here, the battles that were highlighted were often very much the battles in the European theater. If we shift our perspectives to what is probably the most international battle of the First World War, which was the Battle of Gallipoli, on the ground, what you actually would have seen, despite the black and white photos that depict this European war, is you would have seen um, uh, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi boys facing off along with Algerian and Senegalese boys, of course, on behalf of the British and French empires, facing off against Palestinian and Syrian and Iraqi and Hijazi and Turkish boys, both in a battle that they may not have fully understood why it was being fought or its full implications. The First World War was an incredibly traumatic experience for the Muslim world. Between 1/3 and 1/4 of all of Greater Syria died in that war. To give you an idea of just precisely how traumatic it was, I'll share this anecdote as quickly as I possibly can. About a year ago, my father asked me if I was familiar with the word safar berlik, which is not an Arabic word. I'm an Arabic speaker. And he said it's a word that he heard as a child, and it referred to, it's something that people would say to each other if someone was in a really frantic hurry. So of course, after having done some research, I discovered that safar berlik were the words, the Ottoman Turkish words that were written on the conscription cards for the hundreds of thousands of boys that were dragged to go fight in this incredibly bloody conflict. The word itself was synonymous with the Arabic, or was translated into the Arabic, and nafir al-am, which means a general call to arms. Even 100 years later, that word, spoken in a language that functionally no longer exists, still brings memories of a trauma that has not healed.
Mhm. And just that story that you said of how when growing up you never read about this in any of your history books. I grew up the pretty much the same way. None in my history books, none in my social study textbooks. So how can people learn more about the Muslim involvement in the World War?
Actually, what I got was something even worse than not hearing about it. I remember being in high school and flipping through my textbook and trying to see in this global war what was the involvement of the Muslims. How were my ancestors impacted by this? And in flipping through my social studies textbook here in British Columbia, I finally got to one paragraph, a single paragraph that dealt with the Ottoman front, and the paragraph read, "The sick man of Europe." And that was it. Because in the European imagination, the Ottoman Empire was like a piñata waiting to be smashed, and the spoils of that piñata were to be distributed among the victors of the war. That was the perspective going into the First World War. To my shock and surprise, as I researched this over the course of many years, that not only did the sick man of Europe not collapse, but after having delivered several humiliating defeats to the Allied powers, eventually itself had to be defeated in battle.
Mhm. So how can people go about learning all of this history? Where are they supposed to look? Where do they begin looking?
One of the greatest absences in English language literature is a sufficient amount of material that is available for either young readers or lay people, for people who are not historians. There are great books on this subject. One that I would recommend to anyone is Eugene Rogan's The Fall of the Ottomans, just an absolutely fantastic book. There are also a bunch of really terrible books, but that is one that I'd strongly recommend as a beginning point. I would say that is at a reading level that is appropriate for like a late high school or an undergraduate student. Here on the West Coast, I'm involved with Reclaim, and part of the work that we do is going to high schools and going to universities and going to community centers and talking about Islamic history and making the Muslims the protagonists in their own story.
Mhm. Now, I want to touch upon the work that Reclaim does and, of course, what you do with it. But I want to ask, on Remembrance Day, people usually share a specific individual account of a soldier on how they got involved with the war and how it affected them. Can you share an example of a Muslim soldier and how World War I was for them?
Yeah, of course. And to answer this question, I'd like to ask you a question. Here in Canada, when do we commemorate the end of the First World War? Now, of course, I'm asking it kind of facetiously because we both recognize that World War One, at the end of World War One, is commemorated on November 11th, and having ended in 1918. However, that is when the European War ended. Upon the signing of the armistice, the people of the Ottoman Mashriq, that is the Levant, Iraq, the Hijaz, now had to fight the unjust peace that was imposed upon them. In reality, the fighting in the post-Ottoman Mashriq did not end in 1918. It ended several years later, and after intense lobbying on the part of the Arab leadership to have the Europeans fulfill their promise of independence, that never came to fruition. And in fact, what was imposed upon them was a mandate system, which was colonialism in a new language. Eventually, by the summer of 1920, the French military, determined to reap its spoils of war, rolled into Syria. What was for a brief period in history, the Arab Kingdom of Syria, led by Emir Faisal, collapsed, and Emir Faisal took his troops with him. What ended up happening is approximately 20,000 French soldiers came in and told Emir Faisal and his troops to immediately surrender, but a contingent among that army refused to surrender, and they were led by formerly an Ottoman officer named Yusuf al-Azma. So Yusuf al-Azma decided to make a last stand at the Battle of Maysalun. Maysalun was a mountain pass in Syria. And Yusuf al-Azma was a graduate of the Ottoman Staff College. He was the decorated Ottoman general. He was the aide-de-camp to Enver Pasha. He was someone who knew war very well, and so he had no illusions of victory. But he took 1,000 men to Maysalun Pass in order to make this last stand. And because of the stand that they made, the books of history cannot say that Syria was surrendered without a fight. Yusuf al-Azma and hundreds of his fellow soldiers were martyred in the Battle of Maysalun in July of 1920.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly a memorable story. I wanted to learn more about your work with Reclaim, and we don't have too much time, but what is some of the work that you're doing with Reclaim, and how is it related to Remembrance Day?
So what we work to ensure is that the Muslim story is very much part of the Canadian story now, because Muslims are part of Canada. And so whether there were Muslims that fought on behalf of the Allied powers and were not recognized, or whether there were Muslims whose descendants now live here, whose ancestors fought for the Ottoman front, we share those stories in academic contexts like high schools and universities, and hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Brother Bassam. It was great to hear of the work that Reclaim is doing, and also for sharing some of the Muslim history in global war, as we refer to World War I. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.